Don't let me die." Her desperate words hung in the air as the rancher lifted her bloody dress, revealing a wound that made his heart stop. The truth of what happened that night would change everything on the isolated ranch, testing the limits of human compassion and survival. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Eliza Mayfield clutched her swollen belly as she huddled in the darkest corner of the wooden cabin. At 24, her life had become a prison of whispers and shadows. The late afternoon sun filtered through dusty windows, casting golden bars across the rough-hewn floor of the Mayfield family cabin just outside Dodge City. Kansas summers were always brutal, but today the heat seemed especially suffocating, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. The young woman's face bore the faded yellow marks of previous confrontations, her slender frame appearing even more fragile beneath the simple cotton dress that barely concealed her pregnancy. 5 months along now, she could no longer hide her condition from the piercing eyes of her older sister. Lydia Mayfield swept into the cabin like a storm, her expensive silk dress rustling with each deliberate step. In Dodge City, the elder Mayfield sister commanded respect with her perfect posture and calculated smiles. The daughter of one of the territory's founding families, she had cultivated an image of refined grace that made her the undisputed queen of local society. "You disgust me," Lydia hissed, her public mask falling away now that they were alone. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Eliza backed further into the corner, one hand protectively covering her belly. "Please, Lydia, let me explain." "Explain what? How you've brought shame to our family name?" The socialite's carefully manicured fingers curled into fists. "After everything I've done to maintain our position in this town?" The pregnant woman tried to speak, to tell her sister the truth about Ernesto, about the months of cornered conversations and forced affections from Lydia's own husband. But the words died in her throat as Lydia's rage finally boiled over. Without warning, the older sister lunged forward, grabbing Eliza by her long hair and hurling her to the floor. The cabin, once a childhood sanctuary for both Mayfield girls, now echoed with desperate screams as Lydia's fury found its target. "You stupid, ungrateful girl!" Each word punctuated another blow. "Did you think no one would notice? That you could just hide away out here forever?" Eliza curled around her unborn child, tears streaming down her face as she begged for mercy. Outside, the Kansas prairie stretched endlessly beneath the setting sun, its vastness swallowing her cries. No one would hear her. No one would come. And as darkness fell over the cabin, Eliza realized with terrifying clarity that this was only the beginning of her sister's vengeance. Eliza Mayfield clutched her swollen belly, her knuckles white with desperation. "Please, Lydia, think of the baby," she begged, her voice barely a whisper in the wooden cabin's suffocating air. The floorboards creaked beneath her as she tried to crawl away from her sister's fury. Lydia stood over her, eyes cold as prairie winter. "You think I care about that bastard child?" she hissed, bringing her boot down on Eliza's outstretched hand. The younger Mayfield screamed, curling inward to shield her unborn child. "Ernesto is my husband," the socialite continued, each word dripping with venom as she circled her sister like a predator. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't see how you looked at him?" The blows came without mercy, sharp kicks that found Eliza's ribs, her back, her legs. The thin white dress she wore, once pristine, now hung in tatters, dark patches spreading where blood soaked through the fabric. Outside, crickets chirped indifferently as muffled cries escaped through the cabin walls. "I gave you everything," Lydia snarled, grabbing a fistful of her sister's hair. "A home, protection, and this is how you repay me?" Eliza's tears carved clean paths down her dirt-streaked face. "He came to me," she whispered. "I tried to." The confession died as another blow landed. The 24-year-old tasted copper, felt warmth trickling from her nose as she desperately tried to protect her belly with trembling hands. In the dim lamplight, something glinted. A knife from the kitchen table, now in Lydia's grip. The older sister's face transformed, calculation replacing rage. "You'll remember this night," she said, voice suddenly calm. "Every time you look at yourself, you'll remember who you belong to." The blade bit into Eliza's side, carving deliberately. An L took shape in jagged, crude strokes. The pregnant woman's screams echoed through the empty prairie night, but no help came. No one dared interfere in Mayfield business. When dawn broke, painting the Kansas sky in watercolor pinks and golds, Lydia's fury had burned itself out. She stood by the window, adjusting her hairpins as if nothing had happened. "Get her out of my sight," she ordered the servants who had cowered in the kitchen all night. "Take her to Rattlesnake Flats and leave her there." Two men lifted Eliza's broken form, carrying her past the manicured garden and into a waiting wagon. The journey was mercifully short. They deposited her without ceremony in the dust and scrub of the flats, where the sun already promised a scorching day. "God have mercy on you," one whispered, before climbing back onto the wagon. Left alone, Eliza Mayfield closed her eyes against the rising sun, her hand still protectively cradled over her belly. The world was silent except for the crackle of dry grass and the pulse of pain in Eliza's battered body. Each breath was agony, her ribs protesting with sharp stabs that matched the rhythm of her faltering heartbeat. The Kansas prairie stretched endlessly around her, indifferent to her suffering. No trees offered shade, no clouds drifted overhead to block the merciless sun that beat down upon her torn dress and exposed skin. She drifted in and out of consciousness, time losing all meaning. One moment, she was back in the cabin, hearing Lydia's accusations echo off the walls. The next, she was floating somewhere between life and death, the sun burning her skin and hope leaking from every wound. Her parched lips moved in silent prayer, though she wasn't sure anyone was listening. The silver Mayfield necklace around her throat felt like it was choking her, the metal heating under the prairie sun until it branded her skin, another mark to match the cruel L carved into her side. Her hands weakly cradled her swollen belly, the only movement she could manage as the hours crawled by. Shadows lengthened across the plains of Rattlesnake Flats as afternoon surrendered to early evening. The heat remained oppressive, the air thick and still. Eliza's thoughts grew more disjointed, memories blurring with hallucinations. Was that her mother's voice calling? Or just the whisper of wind through the tall grass? Hours blurred until a distant shadow appeared on the horizon, a silhouette that grew larger against the bleeding sunset. A rider approached, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats vibrating through the ground beneath her cheek. The figure materialized slowly, a man on horseback, weathered hat pulled low over his brow. Joao Santos reined in his horse, dust swirling around the animal's legs as it snorted and pawed at the ground. The 52-year-old rancher's eyes narrowed at the motionless figure sprawled in the dust. His leathery face, lined by years of sun and solitude, remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the worn saddle horn. He had been riding the boundaries of his modest property when something, instinct perhaps, or the same sixth sense that had saved him during the war, drew his attention to this particular stretch of prairie. The widower had seen enough death to recognize its approach, but something about the stillness of the young woman made him pause rather than ride on. The rancher dismounted slowly, his joints stiff from hours in the saddle. His horse shifted nervously, sensing the tension in its master as Joao approached the broken form that fate had placed in his path. Joao Santos had seen death before, on battlefields where men fell like wheat before the scythe, and on lonely Kansas roads where travelers succumbed to nature's cruelty. Death was no stranger to a man who'd lived 52 years in this unforgiving land. Yet something about this broken figure made him pause, made him dismount despite the scorching midday heat that shimmered across Rattlesnake Flats. As he approached, his weathered boots crunching against the parched earth, a sound so faint it might have been the prairie wind caught his ear. A broken whisper, trembling through the "Don't let me die." The words hung between them, fragile yet demanding. João knelt beside the young woman, his calloused hands hovering uncertainly over her battered form. Her face, though swollen and caked with blood and dust, bore the unmistakable delicacy of youth. Not much older than 20, he guessed. Her breathing came shallow and irregular, each intake of air seeming to cause her pain. "Miss, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. The rancher noticed the torn white fabric of her dress, once fine, but now reduced to bloodied rags. With gentle movements that belied his rough exterior, João carefully lifted a shred of the material to assess her injuries. His breath caught in his throat. Beneath the fabric lay a canvas of cruelty, purple bruises blooming across her pale skin, dried blood crusting around fresh wounds. And there, carved into the tender flesh of her side, a jagged letter L, not a random mark of violence, but a deliberate brand. Someone had wanted to claim her, to mark her permanently. The sight struck him like a physical blow. Memories he'd buried years ago surged to the surface. His wife, Elena, her body broken by illness, her final days marked by suffering he could not ease. The same helplessness gripped him now, tightening his chest until he could barely breathe. The girl before him was pregnant, her swollen belly visible despite her curled position. 2 lives hanging by the thinnest thread, abandoned to the merciless prairie sun. Who would do this? What kind of monster would leave a pregnant woman to die alone in such agony? João Santos removed his worn leather vest and draped it over her exposed skin, providing what little protection he could against the elements. His mind raced with decisions that needed making. Dodge City was hours away. His cabin, while basic, was closer and had clean water and a bed. "I won't let you die," he promised, the words feeling strange on his tongue after years of speaking mainly to his horse and the empty plains. "Not today." João Santos stared down at the young woman, her body a canvas of violence. Here was another soul abandoned to the merciless Kansas prairie, pregnant, beaten, and left to die by those who should have protected her. The cruel L carved into her flesh reminded him of wounds that went beyond skin, wounds of betrayal that never truly heal. "Don't let me die," Eliza Mayfield had whispered, and those words echoed through him like a church bell. The rancher had seen this before. 20 years ago, his wife had suffered at another's hands, though he'd been too late to save her. Now, fate had given him another chance, another woman betrayed by family. João felt the familiar weight of choice pressing down on his weathered shoulders. Walk away from Dodge City's troubles, or step into a storm that wasn't his to weather. His calloused hand hovered over the silver necklace at Eliza's throat, the name Mayfield catching the harsh prairie sunlight. The Mayfields were powerful in these parts. Helping her meant making enemies he couldn't afford. "I can't leave you here," he finally said, his voice rough from years of solitude. "Not like this." The decision made, João carefully slid his arms beneath Eliza's trembling frame. She weighed almost nothing, this daughter of privilege now reduced to broken breaths and silent tears. He lifted her with the delicate precision of someone handling precious glass, mindful of her swollen belly and the life it contained. His old horse snorted nervously as João approached, the animal sensing the gravity of their burden. The rancher whispered soothing words in Portuguese, a language from his homeland that had always calmed beasts and sometimes men. "Easy now," he murmured, securing Eliza across the saddle before mounting behind her. "We've got precious cargo today." Young woman's body trembled against him, fever or fear or both making her shiver despite the oppressive heat. Joao wrapped one arm around her waist to keep her steady, careful to avoid the fresh wound on her side. The horse shuddered under their combined weight, but the animal was strong and loyal. With a gentle click of his tongue, Joao urged it forward, away from Rattlesnake Flats and toward his modest cabin by the river bend. As they rode, dust rising in their wake, Joao felt the ghosts of his past riding alongside them. He was 52 now, too old for heroics, too scarred for hope. Yet something about Eliza Mayfield's desperate plea had awakened something he thought long dead. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, and Joao Santos rode with grim determination, outrunning both the afternoon heat and the shadows of his memories. They traveled across the scorched plains, the relentless Kansas sun beating down on them as Joao Santos guided his horse with steady hands. Dust billowed behind them like a phantom, marking their path across the empty landscape. The rancher kept one arm firmly around Eliza Mayfield's waist, feeling her shallow breaths against his weathered skin. Her blood had soaked through parts of his shirt, but he pressed onward, determined to reach shelter before the young woman's strength gave out completely. After what seemed like hours, the silhouette of Joao's modest cabin appeared on the horizon, nestled beside a lazy bend in the river. The simple wooden structure had stood alone for 3 years now, ever since his wife had drawn her final breath within those walls. As they approached, the 52-year-old widower felt something stir in the air around the place, as if the cabin itself sensed their arrival, awakening from a long slumber. "Almost there," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if Eliza could hear him through her haze of pain. The horse slowed as they reached the property, its hooves crunching on the dry earth. Each step seemed to breathe life back into the homestead that had known only silence and dust for too long. Joao carefully dismounted, then gently lifted the injured woman from the saddle. Her silver Mayfield necklace caught the light as he carried her across the threshold. Inside, the cabin was spare but clean. Joao had maintained it meticulously, though there had been little reason to do so with only himself to witness the effort. He moved directly to the bedroom and laid Eliza on the sagging bed with its faded quilt and thin pillow. The sheets were worn but freshly laundered, small comforts for a woman who had been left to die. The rancher stood beside the bed, momentarily frozen by the weight of memory. The last time he had placed someone so gently on these sheets had been his wife, her body already cooling, her fight finally over. Now another woman lay before him, hovering between life and death, her pregnant form a stark reminder of all he had lost and could never regain. Joao's calloused fingers trembled slightly as he pulled the quilt over Eliza's battered form. The L carved into their side would need cleaning, but first she needed rest. He lingered a moment longer, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest, before turning to fetch water and supplies. This time, he silently vowed, death would not claim victory in his home. Joao Santos wasn't a man who dwelled in the past, but memories had a way of finding him in the quiet hours. This time, however, it wasn't ghosts that demanded his attention. It was the present, raw and urgent, in the form of a young woman fighting for every breath on his bed. Eliza Mayfield's lips were cracked from dehydration, her voice barely a whisper as it escaped her throat. "Please don't let me die," she pleaded again, the words hanging in the air between them like a prayer. The rancher moved with purpose toward his small kitchen area. His calloused hands, more accustomed to mending fences than tending wounds, wrapped around a battered tin cup. The metal was dented from years of use, much like Joao himself. He filled it with cool water from the bucket he'd drawn from the river that morning. Returning to her side, he gently slipped one arm beneath her shoulders, raising her head just enough. "Small sips," he instructed, his voice low and steady as he held the cup to her parched lips. Eliza's hands trembled as they rose to grasp the cup, but they were too weak to hold it properly. The rancher maintained his grip, tilting it carefully so she wouldn't choke. Water spilled down her chin despite his caution, mixing with the dirt and dried blood that still marked her face. As she drank, a single tear escaped the corner of her eye, cutting a clean path through the grime on her cheek. That solitary tear struck Joao harder than any memory of his own suffering. It carried the weight of everything this young woman had endured: the betrayal by her sister Lydia, the abuse at the hands of Ernesto, and the cruel abandonment that had nearly claimed her life. When she finished drinking, Joao lowered her head back to the pillow. The 52-year-old widower had spent years avoiding entanglements with others, especially those connected to powerful families in Dodge City. Yet here he was, harboring a Mayfield, perhaps the most vulnerable one, but a Mayfield nonetheless. "Thank you," Eliza whispered, her eyes holding his with unexpected clarity despite her condition. Joao nodded, taking the cup back to the table. The silver necklace around her neck caught the fading light from the window, the name Mayfield etched into it glinting like a warning. That name meant power in these parts, and power meant danger. He turned back toward the bed, watching as Eliza's eyelids fluttered, fighting against exhaustion. The pregnant young woman's hand rested protectively over her swollen belly, even in her weakened state. "Rest now," Joao said softly. "You're safe here." As Joao Santos wiped the dust from Eliza's face with a damp cloth, a glint of silver caught his weathered eye. Nestled against her bruised collarbone lay a simple necklace, partially hidden beneath the torn fabric of her dress. With gentle fingers, he moved the pendant into the light streaming through the cabin window. The name Mayfield was elegantly etched into the metal, and the rancher's breath caught in his throat. The Mayfields. Everyone in Dodge City knew that name. They owned half the businesses in town, controlled the bank, and had the sheriff firmly in their pocket. Joao had deliberately kept his distance from town politics and power struggles since settling in the area 15 years ago, preferring the honest company of his livestock to the scheming of Dodge City's elite. "You're a Mayfield," he said quietly, more to himself than to the semi-conscious young woman. Eliza's eyelids fluttered at the sound of her family name, a small whimper escaping her cracked lips. The rancher reached for the tin cup beside the bed, carefully lifting her head to help her drink. Water dribbled down her chin as she swallowed weakly. Joao settled back in his chair, the wooden frame creaking beneath his weight. The revelation complicated everything. This wasn't just some unfortunate soul abandoned on Rattlesnake Flats. This was Eliza Mayfield, daughter of one of the most powerful families in Kansas. The smart thing would be to deliver her to the doctor in town once she was stable enough to travel, wash his hands of the matter, and return to his solitary existence. Yet something in her desperate plea, "Don't let me die," had awakened something he thought long buried after his wife's passing. The girl's determination to cling to life despite her horrific injuries stirred an admiration in him he couldn't easily dismiss. Eliza stirred on the bed, her fingers clutching at the threadbare blanket. Even in her weakened state, she fought. The pregnant young woman had survived being beaten, branded, and abandoned in the merciless Kansas heat when whatever secrets the Mayfield daughter carried, whatever danger helping her might bring to his door, he was already committed to seeing it through. "Rest now," he murmured, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. "You're safe here." Eliza Mayfield's eyes fluttered open, revealing a gaze that pierced through Joao's weathered defenses. Those eyes held more than just physical pain. They carried the weight of unspoken truths and a desperate plea for something beyond mere survival. The rancher shifted uncomfortably on his wooden chair, feeling the weight of her stare. "Water," she whispered, her cracked lips barely moving. Joao reached for the battered tin cup beside the bed, gently lifting her head as she sipped. The silver necklace with Mayfield etched into it caught the dim light filtering through the cabin window. This simple piece of jewelry confirmed what he already suspected. She belonged to one of Dodge City's most influential families, the kind of family that could make a man like him disappear without questions asked. "Thank you," Eliza murmured, her voice stronger than before, but still fragile as prairie grass in winter. The widower nodded silently, setting the cup down. His calloused hands, more accustomed to breaking horses than tending wounds, rested awkwardly on his knees. He sensed that the young woman carried secrets powerful enough to upend the delicate social balance of Dodge City. The carved L on her skin wasn't just a mark of cruelty. It was a warning, a brand of ownership. "You don't have to tell me anything," Joao said finally, his 52 years of life etched in the lines around his eyes. "But I reckon some secrets fester worse than wounds if kept too long." Eliza's fingers clutched at the threadbare blanket covering her pregnant form. Her breathing came shallow and quick, like a wounded animal, still deciding whether to trust or flee. "My sister," she began, then stopped, tears welling. "Lydia has always been admired in town. Nobody would believe what she's capable of behind closed doors." Joao remained still, afraid that any movement might break the fragile thread of her confession. The cabin creaked around them, the sound of the wind through the cracks a lonely accompaniment to her halting words. "I don't know if I can say it," she whispered, shame coloring her pale cheeks. "I don't know if I should." The rancher leaned forward slightly, his voice low and steady. "Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones most needing to be spoken." Eliza closed her eyes, gathering courage from some hidden reserve. When she opened them again, they held a determination that hadn't been there before, a spark of the woman she might have been before violence had marked her body and spirit. "If I tell you," she said, "there's no going back, for either of us." Joao Santos nodded solemnly, understanding that whatever she was about to reveal would forever change both their paths. He was no longer simply a man who had found a wounded girl. He was becoming a witness, perhaps even an ally, in something far larger than himself. Through cracked lips and with trembling fingers clutching the worn blanket, Eliza Mayfield revealed her story in fragments. Joao Santos sat beside her, his weathered face growing darker with each word she spoke. "Lydia isn't just cruel," Eliza whispered. "My sister has always needed to be in control, the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect Mayfield." She paused, wincing as pain shot through her side where the letter was carved. "When our parents died, she became more than my sister. She became my keeper." Joao offered water from the tin cup, his calloused hands steady against her shaking ones. The rancher had seen cruelty before, but this was something else entirely. "Ernesto started watching me differently last winter," Eliza continued, her voice barely audible. "He would find me alone in the house, corner me in hallways. His hands," she closed her eyes. "He told me I was special, that Lydia didn't understand him." The 52-year-old widower turned away, giving her a moment's privacy with her shame. Outside, the prairie wind howled against the cabin walls, mirroring the storm in his chest. When my belly began to swell, I couldn't hide it anymore. Eliza's hand moved protectively over her stomach. Lydia saw immediately. But she didn't blame her husband. She blamed me, called me a temptress, said I'd always been jealous of what she had. Joao's fist clenched against his knee. "And last night?" "She waited until Ernesto left for a business meeting in Wichita. Then Eliza's voice broke. "The knife wasn't meant to kill me. The L was deliberate, her mark. She wanted me branded forever as her property, her shame." A single tear tracked down her dirt-streaked face. "The servants were told to leave me, far enough from town that no one would find me in time." The rancher stood and walked to the window, staring at the vast emptiness of Rattlesnake Flats in the distance. The Mayfields were powerful in Dodge City. Their money reached into every business, every political decision. Going against them wasn't just dangerous, it was potentially fatal. "They'll come looking for me," Eliza said softly. "Not to save me, but to finish what Lydia started." Joao turned back to her, his expression resolute. This young woman, carrying an innocent child, betrayed by those meant to protect her, had awakened something he thought long buried with his wife. "Let them come," he said simply. João Santos sat motionless on the rough-hewn stool beside the bed, his weathered hands clasped tightly together until the knuckles whitened. Each word from Eliza Mayfield's cracked lips drove deeper into his conscience like splinters. His jaw clenched so hard it ached, the muscles along his temple visibly pulsing with restrained emotion. The rancher had built his life around solitude after burying his wife. For years, he'd chosen isolation over involvement, tending his cattle and mending his fences while Dodge City's dramas played out without him. Now this girl, beaten, branded, and betrayed by her own blood, had shattered his carefully constructed walls. "I should have come to town more," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Should have seen what kind of people the Mayfields really were." Eliza shifted painfully on the sagging mattress, the thin blanket rustling beneath her. "Nobody sees what Lydia doesn't want them to see," she whispered. "She's always been careful about that." The 52-year-old rancher rose abruptly, pacing the worn floorboards of his cabin. Outside, the prairie wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, a mournful accompaniment to the horror unfolding inside. He'd known men capable of cruelty during his years on the frontier, but this calculated violence against kin, against a pregnant woman, struck him as something darker. "Your sister," he began, then stopped, unable to find words adequate for such betrayal. "She believes I've disgraced the family name," Eliza said, her hand unconsciously moving to protect her swollen belly. "But Ernesto," her voice faltered, "he cornered me for months, said things would be worse if I refused him." Joao's fist struck the wooden wall, startling them both. The sudden violence of the gesture hung between them, a stark contrast to his otherwise gentle demeanor. "I'm sorry," he said, regaining his composure. "No man should use his power that way." Eliza's trembling hand reached out, catching the sleeve of his faded shirt. Her fingers, once delicate, now bore the marks of her struggle. Dirt beneath the nails, scrapes along the knuckles from clawing at the earth when they'd abandoned her. "I know I made mistakes," she said, her voice breaking. Tears welled in her eyes, cutting clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "But I don't deserve to die for them." Her grip tightened, desperate for understanding. "What would you do in my place?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Joao looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then at the silver Mayfield necklace still clinging to her neck. A bitter irony now, a brand of belonging to a family that had tried to erase her. Joao Santos felt a familiar sense of duty surge through his weathered veins, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his younger days. The rancher had spent years deliberately avoiding entanglements with others' pain, building walls around his heart after his wife's passing. But Eliza Mayfield's broken body and even more fractured spirit awakened something he thought long buried. "I can't leave her," he thought, watching the young woman's chest rise and fall with labored breaths. The silver Mayfield necklace caught the dim light, filtering through the cabin's dusty windows. "If I turn away now, I'll carry that weight forever." He remembered the last time he'd chosen to look away, when a neighboring family had needed help during the drought 3 years back. His reluctance then had cost them dearly. Joao wouldn't make that mistake again, not with someone as vulnerable as Eliza. The 52-year-old rancher moved closer to the sagging bed where she lay. Her pregnant belly formed a gentle mound beneath the threadbare blanket he'd provided. The carved L on her side would heal eventually, but would leave a permanent reminder of her sister's cruelty. What will the Mayfields do when they discover she's alive? He wondered. Dodge City whispered about the family's influence, how they controlled businesses and bent the law to their will. Ernesto Mayfield was known to silence threats with either money or violence, depending on what the situation called for. Joao's calloused hand reached out, gently resting on Eliza's trembling shoulder. Her skin felt cool, despite the summer heat pressing against the cabin walls. "Rest," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're not alone anymore." The simple words seemed to break something inside her. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. Not tears of physical pain, but of something deeper. Perhaps it was the first time in months someone had shown her genuine kindness without expecting something in return. "Thank you," she whispered, her fingers weakly clutching at the edge of the blanket. Joao nodded once, then turned toward the small window that faced Dodge City. The town was just visible on the horizon, church steeple rising above the other buildings like an accusing finger. The rancher's jaw tightened as he considered what lay ahead. A storm was brewing for Dodge City, not of rain and thunder, but of secrets exposed and powerful people held accountable. Joao knew that standing against the Mayfields would make him a target. But looking at Eliza's battered form, he realized some fights were worth the risk. The first rays of dawn filtered through the cabin's weathered slats, casting long shadows across the floor. Joao Santos rose early, his movements deliberate as he prepared for what lay ahead. He'd spent the night in fitful sleep, his mind wrestling with the weight of Eliza's story and the decision that now faced them both. Outside, he saddled his chestnut mare, tightening the leather straps with practiced hands. The horse nickered softly, sensing the tension in her master's touch. Joao patted her neck, drawing comfort from the animal's steady presence, a companion that had witnessed his solitude for years since his wife's passing. When he returned inside, Eliza Mayfield was awake, her eyes clearer than they had been since he'd found her. The young woman sat up with effort, her hand instinctively covering the crude L beneath her borrowed nightshirt. 3 days of rest had returned some color to her cheeks, though the bruises still painted her skin in sickening yellows and purples. "We need to go," Joao said, offering her a cup of water. Eliza's fingers trembled as she accepted it, but her gaze was steady. After drinking deeply, she spoke just one word: church. Joao understood immediately. The church was the heart of Dodge City, a place where truth held weight, where even the powerful Mayfields couldn't silence a voice raised in its hallowed space. She wanted witnesses. She wanted protection in numbers. Most of all, she wanted her story heard where no one could look away. "Are you strong enough?" he asked, his weathered face creased with concern. The pregnant woman nodded, determination hardening her features. "I have to be." Joao helped her dress in one of his late wife's simple frocks, too large but clean and whole, unlike the bloodied tatters she'd arrived in. He supported her weight as she stood, her body still weak but her spirit unyielding. Outside, the rancher lifted Eliza onto his horse with gentle hands, mindful of her injuries and the life she carried. He mounted behind her, one arm securing her trembling frame against his chest. The silver Mayfield necklace caught the morning light as they set off, a silent testament to the family that had tried to erase her. They rode slowly across the prairie toward Dodge City, the horse's steady gait carrying them closer to confrontation with each passing minute. The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating Eliza's face, no longer the face of a victim, but of a survivor determined to speak her truth. "Whatever happens," Joao said quietly, "you're not alone anymore." Eliza's hand found his, squeezing with surprising strength. No more words passed between them as the town's buildings appeared on the horizon, growing larger with each hoofbeat. The dusty main street of Dodge City hummed with morning activity. Merchants rolled barrels outside their storefronts, women gathered at the water pump exchanging hushed gossip, and children darted between wagons, their laughter cutting through the early heat. It was an ordinary day in the frontier town, until Joao Santos appeared at the end of the street. The 52-year-old rancher rode slowly, his weathered frame supporting Eliza Mayfield, who leaned against him, barely conscious. Her torn dress revealed glimpses of bruises and that cruel carved letter. The horse moved deliberately toward the white-steepled church at the center of town, drawing every eye as it passed. "That's one of the Mayfield girls," someone whispered, the words spreading like wildfire through the gathering crowd. Joao dismounted first, then carefully lifted Eliza from the saddle. Her silver necklace caught the morning light as he carried her up the church steps, her blood staining his faded shirt. The townspeople followed at a distance, drawn by curiosity and dread. Inside the church, sunlight filtered through simple stained glass, casting colored shadows across wooden pews. The rancher laid Eliza gently on a bench near the pulpit, her breathing shallow but persistent. Reverend Thomas hurried forward, his Bible clutched to his chest, eyes widening at the sight of her injuries. "Good Lord," the preacher gasped, kneeling beside her. "What happened to this child?" The congregation gathered at the doorway and filled the back pews, their Sunday clothes replaced by work aprons and dusty boots. Among them stood the town doctor, the sheriff, and several members of the town council, people whose opinions shaped Dodge City's justice. Joao stood tall beside Eliza, his calloused hand resting protectively near her shoulder. His face, lined by years of sun and solitude, remained steady as he looked out at the assembled townspeople. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the church, unwavering despite his usual preference for silence. "This girl was beaten and left to die in Rattlesnake Flats," he said, each word measured and clear. "I found her yesterday, carved and broken." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The sheriff stepped forward, hand resting on his belt. "Who would do such a thing, Santos?" Joao looked down at Eliza, whose eyes had opened slightly, giving him a barely perceptible nod. He turned back to face the town, shoulders squared, ready to speak the truth that would shatter Dodge City's carefully maintained facade. "Her own family," he declared, his voice echoing off the church walls. "And they need to answer for what they've done. This girl is Eliza Mayfield. She's been beaten, carved, and left for dead by her own sister, Lydia Mayfield, and by Ernesto Mayfield, who preyed on her innocence." The congregation gasped collectively, the sound rippling through the wooden pews like wind through prairie grass. Women clutched their handkerchiefs to their mouths, while men shifted uncomfortably, their Sunday boots scraping against the floor. Children were quickly hushed by mothers who pulled them closer, shielding innocent eyes from the brutal truth unfolding before them. Whispers erupted in every corner of the church. A Mayfield? Doing such a thing? That poor girl. Could it be true? The words bounced off the humble walls, growing louder with each passing moment. Some parishioners' eyes filled with disbelief. The Mayfields were pillars of Dodge City society after all, while others burned with righteous fury at the injustice laid bare before God and community. The preacher stood frozen at his pulpit, Bible clutched in trembling hands, as the congregation's murmurs swelled into a tide of judgment and compassion. Eliza lay still on the bench, her breathing shallow, the carved L on her side hidden, but its presence felt by everyone who dared look at her battered form. Then came the moment that seemed to stop time itself. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church creaked open, the sound cutting through the chaos like a knife. Sunlight spilled in, creating a dramatic silhouette that commanded immediate silence. Lydia Mayfield swept in, dressed in fine blue silk that rustled with each confident step. Her chin remained high, face a perfect mask of indignation rather than guilt. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had never been questioned, never been challenged, her presence demanding the respect she believed was her birthright. Behind her, Ernesto Mayfield followed, his face set in stone. The rancher noticed immediately how the man's right hand hovered near his hip, fingers twitching close to the pistol, partially concealed beneath his expensive coat. His eyes were hard, calculating, scanning the room for threats while occasionally darting toward Eliza's broken form with something between contempt and fear. The congregation parted instinctively, creating a path through the center aisle. No one dared speak as the couple approached, their footsteps echoing in the tense silence. João Santos stood his ground beside Eliza, weathered hand resting protectively near her shoulder, his 52 years of hard living etched into every line of his determined face. The Mayfields stopped several paces away, and for one breathless moment, the entire church hung suspended between truth and power, between justice and influence, waiting to see which would prevail in the heart of Dodge City. The words sent a visible chill through the crowd, mothers pulling children closer, men shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Ernesto Mayfield's hand moved deliberately to his pistol, fingers twitching with barely contained rage. His eyes, cold and calculating, darted between his sister-in-law and the rancher who had brought her to this sanctuary. The wealthy man's jaw clenched tight, a vein pulsing at his temple as he took one step forward, then another. João Santos didn't flinch. The weathered rancher simply moved with quiet determination, positioning himself between the Mayfields and Eliza. His 52 years of life had taught him when to stand firm, and this moment demanded nothing less. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his calloused hand resting calmly on the worn handle of his old revolver. "This isn't your concern, Santos," Ernesto growled, his voice low but trembling with barely contained violence. "Family matters should stay within the family." The rancher didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. His resolve was enough, a silent promise that violence would be met with equal force. His eyes, steady and unblinking, held Ernesto's gaze without wavering. "She asked for my help," João replied simply, his voice carrying through the church. "And I gave my word." Behind him, Eliza's breathing quickened, her hand instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly. The silver Mayfield necklace caught the light as she shifted, a bitter reminder of the family name that had nearly killed her. Several townspeople rose from their pews, standing in silent support of the rancher and the wounded young woman. The preacher stepped forward, Bible clutched to his chest, his presence adding weight to this impromptu tribunal. Lydia's perfectly composed facade cracked slightly, her eyes darting around the church as she realized how many witnesses were present. For perhaps the first time in her life, the queen of Dodge City's society found herself powerless to control the narrative. Ernesto's fingers still hovered near his weapon, but uncertainty had crept into his expression. The church was no longer just a building of worship. It had become a courtroom where the truth was finally being heard. João Santos' weathered voice carried through the church with unexpected power. "This town deserves the truth. You won't silence it today." His words hung in the air, simple yet resolute, carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much suffering to stand by silently anymore. The congregation, initially frozen in shock, began to stir. Men who had tipped their hats to the Mayfields for years slowly rose from their pews, faces hardening with newfound courage. Women clutched their prayer books, whispering hushed supplications while casting sidelong glances at Eliza's broken form. Children, sensing the tension, clung to their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed and solemn. "The girl was left to die," the rancher continued, his calloused hand resting protectively on Eliza's shoulder. "Left in Rattlesnake Flats like discarded trash. Is this what Dodge City stands for now?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, growing louder with each passing second. The town blacksmith stepped forward, followed by the schoolteacher and the elderly widow who ran the general store. One by one, ordinary citizens formed a human barrier between the Mayfields and their victim. Ernesto's face, usually flushed with confidence, drained of color. His fingers twitched near his holster, but he found himself paralyzed by the dozens of accusing eyes boring into him. The predator had become prey, cornered by the very community he had assumed would never dare challenge him. "You have no proof," Lydia attempted to shout, but her voice, the same voice that had commanded Dodge City's social circles for years, cracked mid-sentence. She tried again, lifting her chin in defiance, but the words died in her throat as she watched the sheriff push through the crowd, his badge catching the light streaming through the stained glass windows. The power she once wielded, built on fear and false propriety, slipped away like sand through her fingers. Her silk dress, which had seemed so regal when she entered, now appeared gaudy and inappropriate against the honest wood of the church pews. "Show them," Joao said softly to Eliza. With trembling hands, she turned slightly, revealing the cruel L carved into her flesh, a brand of ownership that had become, ironically, the evidence of Lydia's downfall. A collective gasp filled the sacred space. The preacher, finding his voice at last, stepped forward with his Bible clutched to his chest. "The Lord sees all," he proclaimed, his voice gaining strength, "even what happens behind closed doors." As the sheriff approached the Mayfields, Joao Santos stood tall, not as an outsider but as the conscience of Dodge City, a simple rancher who had reminded them all what justice truly meant in the heart of the Wild West. The preacher stood tall in the hushed church, his weathered hand raised toward the rafters. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting judgment in colored shards across the wooden floor. Every eye in the congregation watched as he spoke words that would forever change Dodge City. "What has been done to Eliza Mayfield is both a sin before God and a crime against man," he declared, his voice carrying to the farthest pew. "No family name, no matter how powerful, stands above God's law or man's justice." Lydia Mayfield's face drained of color. For the first time in her life, her social standing offered no protection. The townspeople who once smiled at her in deference now stared with unveiled disgust. Her fingers clutched at her silk dress, twisting the expensive fabric as her carefully constructed world collapsed around her. Beside her, Ernesto shifted nervously, his hands still hovering near his holster. The men of the town had moved closer, forming an unspoken barrier between him and any escape. The shopkeeper's wife, who had once laughed at his jokes, now spat at his feet. The banker who had dined at their table last Sunday turned his back in silent condemnation. "The law will decide your punishment," the preacher continued, "but this community has already rendered its verdict." Sheriff Thomas appeared at the church entrance, summoned by the commotion. He approached with measured steps, his badge catching the light. "Ernesto and Lydia Mayfield, you'll be coming with me to answer some questions about what's happened to your kin." As the couple was led away, whispers rippled through the congregation. The Mayfields had always been untouchable, their money buying silence, their influence securing power. Now they walked with heads bowed, shame weighing on them, heavier than any iron chains. Joao Santos stood protectively near Eliza, who watched her sister and brother-in-law with tears streaming down her pale face. Not tears of sorrow, but of relief. The truth had finally broken free. "What happens now?" someone asked, the question hanging in the air like gunsmoke. The rancher placed a gentle hand on Eliza's shoulder. "Justice happens," he answered simply, but beyond justice lay uncertainty. Where would Eliza go? What would become of her child? The town that had turned a blind eye to the Mayfields' cruelty now faced its own reckoning. Could they make amends for their silence? As the church emptied, leaving only Eliza, Joe, and the preacher, the young woman touched the scar on her side through her dress. The L would always remain, but its meaning had changed. No longer a mark of Lydia's ownership, but a reminder of liberation. Eliza Mayfield, the girl Dodge City had written off as another tragic footnote, found herself alive against all odds. The wooden cabin by the riverbend that Joe Santos called home became her sanctuary, a place where healing happened in quiet moments between sunrise and sunset. The spring winds still whistled through the cracks in the walls, carrying prairie dust and the scent of wildflowers. But with each passing day, hope crept in alongside them. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at the church. The young woman's body, once a canvas of purple bruises and angry red gashes, slowly reclaimed itself. The swelling around her eyes had subsided, allowing her to witness the world anew. Her split lip had sealed, and the cuts on her arms had scabbed over, leaving behind thin pink lines that would eventually fade to silver. Only the L carved into her side remained angry and defiant, a permanent reminder not of Lydia's ownership as intended, but of Eliza's endurance. She traced it sometimes with trembling fingers, no longer with shame, but with a strange pride. She had survived what was meant to destroy her. In the afternoons, she would sit by the east-facing window, the same one where Zhuang's late wife had once watched for his return from the fields. The wooden chair creaked beneath her weight as she rested her hand on her growing belly, feeling the first butterfly flutters of the life within. 5 months along now, her pregnancy was becoming more visible each day, a small dome rising beneath her borrowed dress. The townsfolk brought offerings, jars of preserves, hand-stitched baby clothes, and whispered apologies for looking away for so long. They left these gifts on the porch steps, few brave enough to face the young woman whose suffering had exposed the rot beneath Dodge City's veneer of civilization. The Mayfield name, once spoken with deference, now carried the stain of scandal. Ernesto had fled in the night, taking what money he could gather. Lydia remained in their grand house, a queen without subjects. Her social circle evaporated like morning dew under the harsh prairie sun. Eliza watched the horizon from her window, listening to the quiet hum of life continuing. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the distant lowing of Joao's cattle. The rancher had given her space to heal, never pressing for decisions about tomorrow. There was only today, and the miracle that she had lived to see it. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, whispering a prayer of gratitude. The girl who had begged not to die was learning, slowly and painfully, how to live again. Joao Santos rose with the sun each morning, his weathered hands finding purpose in the soil and wood of his land. The 52-year-old rancher mended broken fences that had long been neglected, cleared overgrown paths, and tended to his small herd with renewed vigor. From the cabin window, Eliza Mayfield watched him work, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly. The rancher never asked how long she would stay, and she never spoke of leaving. Their arrangement had no name, no definition beyond the unspoken understanding that had formed between them. Joao would return from his daily labors to find a simple meal waiting, the cabin swept clean, or wildflowers arranged in his late wife's chicked vase. Neither mentioned these small gestures of gratitude. "The baby kicked today," Eliza said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching purple shadows stretch across the plains. Joao nodded, offering a rare smile that softened the lines etched into his face by years of solitude. "Life finds a way," he replied, his calloused fingers working a piece of leather into a small pouch. The young woman noticed he'd been crafting little things, a wooden cradle, soft deerskin wrappings, preparing for the child without presumption or demand. The scar on her side still burned sometimes, the cruel L, a permanent reminder of her sister's betrayal. Yet each day, the mark seemed to carry less weight. Lydia and Ernesto Mayfield had fled Dodge City after the church confrontation, their reputation in tatters, their power dissolved by the truth. Some townsfolk brought supplies to the riverside cabin, offering quiet support without intrusion. The preacher visited once, blessing the household and the unborn child before departing, with respectful understanding of the sanctuary they had created. At night, when nightmares jolted Eliza awake, she would find Joao already sitting in the rocking chair near her bed, silent guardian against the darkness. He never touched her, never presumed, but his presence alone was enough to chase away the shadows of memory. Their healing came not through grand declarations or promises, but through the steady rhythm of days shared in mutual respect. The cabin that had once echoed with emptiness now breathed with quiet purpose. Joao's grief for his wife found peace in protecting another, while Eliza's wounds slowly closed in the safety of acceptance. Sometimes, in the golden hour before sunset, they would walk together to the river's edge, two souls damaged by life, yet somehow finding wholeness in their brokenness. No words of love passed between them. They didn't need them. Their bond was deeper than romance, forged in the crucible of survival and choice. Day by day, they chose each other when the world had turned away.